Okay.
Okay, so it should be going live on all the platforms now. Kate, I know you have Twitch open, so let me know. I'm going to check them too. Thank you.
Okay.
We are live on Twitch.
Are we good? Good. All right. So welcome everyone to the SASA Book Club live Q&A with an author. Today we'll be talking about The Good Kings, Absolute Power in Ancient Egypt and the Modern World with Dr. Cooney. We hosted by Minniti and myself, Cassandra May. So just a brief bit about SASA, the Save Ancient Studies Alliance. Our mission is to reverse the current downward trend in the study of the ancient world by engaging the public and bringing together students and scholars to share their passion for the study of the ancient world in order to inspire a vast new generation of students. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, all the socials. I believe we have a TikTok now as well. We'll have to find that link and put it in the chat for everyone. So a bit about our live event protocol, just basic expectations. We ask that everyone be kind and respectful, listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event. Please be patient with us with technology and as we administer it. Sometimes it's a bit of a learning curve. SASA live events, as said, they're all live streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. And we do record and archive everything as well. Recordings will be posted on the above platforms after the event. And lastly, have fun. And if you enjoy our live events, we do archaeo gaming, book clubs, reading groups. Please consider becoming a supporter of SASA with a monthly donation for as little as $3 a month. You can also help Save Ancient Studies. Go to saveancientstudies.org/donate to learn more. And I will now stop sharing my screen. And we should be good to go. Kate, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good whichever time zone you are. I'm Kate Minniti. You usually see me and hear my voice and see my wife flailing in the SASA archaeo gaming streams, but for today I will be the co-host of this book club. I am a PhD candidate from the University of British Columbia in what is now called, because my department has changed name, Mediterranean Archaeology. I deal with Egyptian stuff in Sicily. I have an MA in Egyptian archaeology from UCL, and I am delighted to introduce our guest today, Professor Cooney, who is a professor of Egyptian art and architecture at UCLA, writer, podcaster, a public figure, can we say that? And we are delighted to have her here to talk about her newest book, The Good Kings. So thank you for joining us, Professor. We're really happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me on, and apologies for my setup. I find myself in Hawaii visiting my husband's family, so there will be bird chirping, maybe some cars driving by, and this lovely background. But I'm right. I have a little garden view, which is nice, but you won't see that. You're going to see the laundry on the line because that's the kind of house I'm in right now, where you just hang the laundry out in the patio. And so welcome to the Hawaii setup.
Oh, I'm very, very happy to have you here. Also, SASA, as a rule, welcomes all sorts of animals interrupting our live streams. So we are not opposed. We're not opposed to that. Okay, so I have all the chats open, everything. If anyone has questions, you can send them in the Twitch chat. You can send them on the YouTube chat. We're monitoring those on the Facebook chat too, I believe. We will read questions out. But I think we should start with the ritual opening question to our author. How did you come up with the idea for this book?
Yeah, the book kind of grabbed me by the neck and wouldn't let go. Essentially,
very in character for pharaohs.
You got to write it. And I was like, okay, I have to write it. And it was in the midst of 2020 with all the madness in the United States of America that entails. I think that anybody who's in America or not in the United States realizes that the problems of patriarchal late capitalism are hitting us with a ferocity and an intensity that one cannot deny. And I think it's very easy for people outside of the United States to think, well, we don't have that kind of racism here, or our country wasn't founded on that kind of social inequality. And they might be right a couple of steps, a couple of degrees away, but let me also guarantee that most places in Europe benefited from American theft of indigenous lands and use of free Black body labor. So all of these things are, coming to a head in the United States in a very interesting way. And they're coming to a head in terms of the nascent authoritarianism, which is obviously, I wrote this during the Trump administration, and I wrote this after the riots of police killings, continuous police killings of Black people for doing nothing more than, trying to spend something with a $20 counterfeit bill, and then they have to get killed, and all of these things that we do in our country. So the way that I was thinking is that Egypt is kind of a gateway drug for the public. And I think that works for this discussion with SASA. Egypt is something where, ancient Egypt in particular, you can start 10 steps ahead, as opposed to, oh, I'm doing Byzantine studies, and people are like, what? But if you're talking about ancient Egypt, either from gaming or movies or something, they know where they are situated. They know what it means. They know what the kingship is basically like. They know the crook and flail. They know some of the crowns. The public already has a great deal of education. So you can start at a higher level, a more nuanced level. And everyone knows who Khufu is. Everyone knows who Ramses is. That's kind of crazy. Not everyone knows who Hammurabi is. And so you can lead people into a discussion of authoritarianism. And then in my typical subversive way, which pisses off so many of my colleagues, I then compare ancient and modern throughout to try to de-fetishize ancient Egypt, to try to ask what it is we are all trying to claim, and to try to help us understand that we are them and they are us, and they are not some separate, particularized ancient people with which we have nothing in common, but their communities of practice are our own. And we are their recipients of it, and this is the end game thereof. And that's so it really did grab me by the neck. I'm not kidding. And I just had to write this. I felt compelled to write it, and I wrote it in an interesting way. But you can ask me about that later. So that's the long answer to your first question.
No, yeah, I appreciated that, and I'm glad you led into the way you did. When I was reading the book, in particular, the introduction really grabbed me, titled "We Are All Pharaoh's Groupies," and I was like, I have to read that. How am I a Pharaoh's groupie? And I really liked that you juxtaposed particularism and universalism as far as how we view ancient Egypt. And then, you brought into the discussion comparing Egyptian pyramids with Confederate monuments in a way to bring it into how we view the current world. And I was wondering a bit, like, how do you address critics to that topic? Because I know there are a lot of people who are going to push back against that and argue that they actually have very little in common.
Yeah, it's for those who say that they have very little in common, I would say that they're often the same people who say, oh, we don't have racism here, or we don't have those issues here, and what you're talking about, you can't compare these things. Ancient Egypt is so very different. All I can say is that fetishization of an ancient place is a dehumanization, and akin to a kind of racism where we put people in a particular bubble. And these were humans like anybody else, coming up with human systems like anybody else. And the other thing that I would add to that criticism is that they're both patriarchal systems. One is maybe an original primary state patriarchy. That's fine, but that doesn't mean it's not collecting tips and tricks from other patriarchies to make this system work better. And it's not like, if we had nothing in common with one another, then why do nationalist systems and white supremacist systems cleave so closely to these antiquities to claim them? And why, if we had nothing in common, is it is it so powerful to say, oh, we are Israel and this is the, we the inscription of David and thus this is our land? Or, oh, to put a pyramid on a Jim Crow statue or some sort of Egyptian symbol, if it weren't powerful, why would we do that? So I see the similarities so clearly. I think a lot of the people who say, no, they have nothing in common, the arguments, unfortunately, are similar to people saying, oh, you're taking our heritage away, when they're talking about Jim Crow statues, or this is our history, how dare you malign it? And I think that everything deserves to be criticized. I don't mind people getting really butthurt, as I like to say, about reading my book. And I have had this response from dear colleagues who say, one of the worst, not worst, but one of the most pointed criticisms from a very close Egyptological colleague who will remain unnamed, is she said, I agree with everything you're saying, but don't you dare say that you didn't know that they were authoritarians, that you were somehow taken by surprise. And that is a key part of the book, but it's, I think all of us are rather taken by surprise, and myself included. There was an honest discussion in this book of how I came into it as an Egypt lover, an Egyptophile. And then it's not that I don't love Egypt anymore. It's not like I'm like, oh no, I can't be a part of that at all in any way, shape, or form. I'm still deeply entrenched in this work, but I'm less enamored in a non-critical way. So yeah, so I think that my journey of falling in love with these people and then having a more nuanced and holistic understanding of what it is I'm a part of is the same journey as maybe being an American growing up, not these days, but growing up as I did in the 70s and having all the patriotism and shining city on a hill and all of the stuff that is said about the United States of America. And then you look around, you're like, oh my God, this is the shining city on a hill. We all need that moment. We all need to understand our own racism, our own privileges, unfair privileges, if we have them. And then we can come to this with a more fair critique. So I really rebel against a positivist view of antiquity, of modern states, of people saying, oh, well, that's not my problem. Because as we become more global and connected, all of these things are everybody's problem, in my opinion.
Yes, very much. Cassandra's having some issues with video going in and out, but it's okay. I'm here. That's why we're two here. I like that response a lot. And then actually, when I was reading, I was, first of all, not taken aback, but very pleasantly surprised, because I'm a post-medieval Europe nerd with the comparison with the Sun King. Because when you say Sun King, that's Louis XIV. And I was very pleased to read the whole part when you talk about Khufu, about how every physical function of the king had to be ritualized, and how that also happened in, very civilized, quote unquote, white 17th century France, which is a comparison that I don't think I've read too often, when between at least between like Old Kingdom kings and Louis XIV. But also something else that really struck me, because I come from a more classics background in classical archaeology, is when you said that we were all drinking the Pharaoh's Kool-Aid. And I was reminded of how we're all drinking the Athenian Kool-Aid. Yeah. We're all drinking the 5th century Athenian Kool-Aid. Yeah. But then again, we are not drinking the Achaemenid Kool-Aid. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that in terms of, more global archaeology and which civilizations we are believing, or whose propaganda we are believing, as opposed to whose propaganda we are not believing. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, at UCLA, we're starting a consortium called Global Antiquity, which is essentially trying to level a playing field of antiquity studies, not against classics, though it may be perceived that way by some people, because classics has had the upper hand in ancient studies for as long as its discipline has existed, which is many hundreds of years, if not thousands, going back to ancient Rome, who potentially invented this historiographic discipline. And we find ourselves at UCLA probably because of exile after the fall of the Shah, and how many Iranians as were moved to the United States and settled in Los Angeles. And we call it Tehrangeles for a reason. And so because of that community of Iranian Americans, we have an excellent ancient Iranian studies program. And so I'm now training with my colleague, Professor Rahim Shaigan, a number of graduate students. Elizabeth Koch, Hongyu Chen come to mind in particular, who are working on becoming unicorns, people who can read ancient Persian languages and ancient Egyptian and come at these texts from a balanced perspective. And they also have some classical background as well. And when you bring that into it, you're like, oh, okay, look at how we're prioritizing the Greek text over the Persian. But this is where things get really interesting for me as an Egyptologist, because Egypt doesn't reveal its realpolitik either. It doesn't let that open. It keeps everything perfected. Now it produces a shit ton of material, and it has temples and reliefs, and we want for nothing. There is an embarrassment of riches for Egyptological texts and material. So it doesn't feel like there's an imbalance in the data. But when it should be like that when you compare ancient Iran to the Greek world, but because we historians prioritize the text, Persia always loses, and Persia will always lose that propaganda war. And it's so interesting to me to see how it's the same with Cleopatra, right? Cleopatra creates this perfected image in Egypt, and yet in the text, and where all that text heavy stuff is, she's dissolving pearls in vinegar. She's given the army the plates and the dinnerware. She's like this lascivious, greedy, horrible woman. And we believe that because there is no text to counteract it. And because these people would never, the Persians would never, the Egyptians would never, they would never lower themselves in their patriarchal system to discussing realpolitik in such an open and boring way. They would never. So you have to understand the different systems and how one comes at it. And it's a really interesting endeavor. And the more I study ancient Iran through my colleagues and through workshops and other things, the more I realize that Egypt is not imperial at all. But Egyptologists love to throw the world imperial. The age of empire, the Levantine Empire, all of these things, really when Egypt was a hegemony that would extend to a certain part on the Orontes and the Levant and to the Second Cataract in Nubia, and then that's it. And they would never go beyond. And their system was not imperial in that it needed to pull in new territories and new people to grow, to exist. That is not what Egypt was. Not certainly what it is now. It is that first nation state, that first regional state in a way. And it is only through comparison that you can really understand that. So the other thing I would, Kate, because I really like this question, not only can you go east and compare the West with the East and try to balance it, but you can also go south into Africa and look at Sudan and Ethiopia even, and try to balance how Egypt is always prioritized. And Egyptologists, when they say, oh, I'm a Nubiologist, I'm doing Nubian studies, they're always, almost always doing it. And I just talked with Aaron D'Souza about this, we were going off. They almost always do it through the lens of Egypt first. Egypt is the dominator. Egypt is the start of the discussion. And then we're going to get to these indigenous peoples who were effed over, and we'll discuss them a little, but they're kind of an afterthought because of text. And the prioritization of text is such a dangerous thing. And I mean dangerous in a true, I can't tell you how many times I've been told, well, you know, the Egyptians said it, you should take them at their word. This is their text. And how do you then impart to the scholar of the last generation that we as historians have to not take the text at its word? Would a modern historian take Gulf War documents through the Freedom of Information Act at their word, or would they critically try to understand what's actually going on, understand genre, understand, oh, that's a financial text, so I can understand it a little differently than this speech of the leader, and try to work with these things in different ways. So a million times yes, and a million times we can see these prioritizations all around us in the same way that we see our own white privilege and the colonialism of the white over the black. And Egypt is an interesting place for this right now as a nation state, going through an extraordinary nationalistic moment, and within this crucible of globalization, and to see all of this happening there, it makes it even more interesting as a discussion.
That was a great answer. Thanks a lot. I have a lot of beef with making text more important than than the archaeological material and the material culture and everything else. And also, I was wondering, just like a sort of a follow up, but like, why do you think there is so much resistance in the scholarship to critically assessing ancient texts? Because we should know it's propaganda, right? It's made very clear that this is one-sided propaganda, if we can use that word. I know that some people don't like to use it. But why is
I
there
didn't
so
used
much?
to use it. I used to refuse to use propaganda too, but now I do. So yeah.
This is me and the Roman history classes that I've been taking, archaeology classes that I've been taking. We can't say Augustan propaganda. But why do you think there is so much resistance in reading these texts critically, as if we 100% believe that they were, writing only what was true and not what was convenient for them, right? It sounds like counterintuitive from an external perspective. So maybe as an internal person to the academia, you could explain that also for our listeners and viewers.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. It's a very hard question to answer because we are all this is the water in which we ourselves swim, and I think that's why it becomes so difficult. Let me give you a case study that I think will help answer this. So, my work on female power, right? And people have read my book When Women Ruled the World, and they get all mad and again butthurt. I like this
that
term.
was my next question.
Oh well,
hold that thought.
Well, let me just put it in this term really fast, that, and you can ask me more about that one. But this idea that people say, well, this is a tragedy. This is depressing. You've given us all of these female rulers and you've cut them off at the knees by saying they're just tools of the patriarchy. And I think it's the reason that people have a hard time rewriting these stories is because the stakeholders want the story to be a certain way. So it serves a patriarchal purpose to say, look, women ruled the world once. They did it in Egypt. And if they did it then you're doing it now. Yay. It's the same way in the United States in the 6th grade. They present these women to young girls and say, Hatshepsut was a queen of Egypt. They don't say female king. They say she was a great queen and you can do it too. And so it's this positivist rhetoric essentially saying women have made it, women have done it, and we're done. Or it might be presented, particularly in a California textbook, as Black women have made it and we're done. And it's all over and we're post-racial or whatever it is people want to present. So it serves the purposes of the people in power to make it seem like this is a happier, fuzzier regime than it really was, or to make ancient Egypt more religious and less authoritarian. That's something that people feel more comfortable with. Well, they did it because of religion. Well, what does that mean? And why can't you look at ancient Egyptian religion through this baldly, starkly reorienting lens of authoritarianism and patriarchy as well? So it doesn't, all I'm saying in the answer to your question is that I think as the stakeholders of antiquity change, this discussion will change. But as the stakeholders are still stuck in their particularist lenses, I was trained, maybe not you as much, you were, I was certainly trained. You do not step out of the box of the ancient people you are studying. You don't question their texts beyond a certain point. And to do comparative work is verging on immoral and highly problematic. It is destabilizing to the core. And so I think it destabilizes all kinds of modern systems. And I'd have to think about more why and how. But antiquity is very enmeshed in our modern lives.
Yes, and to add to that from our Twitch chat, Balaji is saying that Ramesses II and Kadesh always come to mind with propaganda. That is true. That's like one of the first things that you are taught at a higher level. When I started, I was like, oh yes, he went to battle and he won, and not really that. But I don't think like that is like the glaring example, but other things we don't question as much.
No, there's so many things we don't question. That's why I start the chapter with the pyramid, because the pyramid is so unquestioned that we have history channels, ancient aliens, that tells us that it was built by superhumans, non-humans, uber-humans, right? That's how much we don't question the power of the pyramid over our own mind. And that pyramid needs to be deconstructed as propaganda, as a weapon of the mind, as something that gets us to give up our own personal or community-based endeavors in favor of one man, who is our God King. And how do you get somebody to do that? And this, putting all of this labor into the construction of this thing, it's amazing how we don't question just that more. So you got to pop that bubble, because the pyramid is really often that crunchy candy coating that gets people into Egypt and makes them really become an Egyptophile. And you've got to be like, no, this is a mortuary industrial complex. This is a method of getting people to believe in a royal power. It's also a method of the king creating more power because it's been lost. You build a pyramid not because you can, but because you have to. And it's also a method of elites taking their power back. The two things work hand in hand in that. The other thing that when I'm writing about authoritarianism and power is we do so in Egyptology all the time. The king ordered, the king said, the king did this. And it's not the king, it's the king and his collection of cronies, elites, hangers-on, entourage, whatever words you want to use. That's the driving force behind the king. And the king can be so divinized, to use David Graeber and Marshall Sahlins' understanding of kingship, that it is without power at all. And it is the elites who are running the show. And that's a very interesting thing to see for ancient Egypt. And you could see that kind of sliding along, when the king is more divinized, when he gets more in the trenches, and on and on. Yeah. You could do this in American politics, which I do, right? Like Reagan is the divinized one. Was he making decisions? Probably not. But his elites were certainly running the show. And so to be able to see that, you're like, oh yeah, I guess we do still do things like that. Oh, okay. And that's, and it's a useful lens to look through, I find.
Excellent. I'm not too knowledgeable on American politics from, before I was able to understand things and before I moved here, but I'll have to read more now.
No, don't worry. No.
Maybe I should. Cassandra, do you have any other questions, or I can just trudge through? Let me know, because I don't want to monopolize.
No, you're fine. I'm enjoying the exchange. Just, going back to kind of how you were talking about how we're taught to think as classicists about the past. This is still something that, I'm currently in a master's program myself for classics and ancient history, just in general. And I'd say still probably about half of the professors stick to that old ideal of we're not going to step outside of the framework that's handed to us by the ancients. And even just the concept of historiography is kind of thrown to the side a bit with ancients. And so I am really glad to see someone with such a public profile coming out and discussing this in a wider way.
And I think there's a huge amount of room for people to do this from a classical perspective. I think, even the term classics is so loaded. What does that even mean, right? But, Rome, I think, is easier to give the side eye to, right? Because they're so open about their prurient ways, their takedowns of each other in a political manner. They're just, this is Rome. Greece, I think we idealize so much more. And this idea of taking down demokratia itself as a means of men maintaining patriarchal power, I think would be so shocking for people. But it certainly is anti-woman and anti-minority as you can possibly get. There is no better way of creating a stranglehold of patriarchal power than this demokratia. And I think we need to look at it from that perspective. Very few people do. It is the shining city on a hill. It is the ideal. And so Sparta will be demonized and Athens will be glorified and they will have noble wars. And we always know what side to take, particularly in the Persian Greek wars as well, because one is the despot and the other is the shared power. But that democratia is, still an elite-driven system, and it is the rare professor that tells you, oh, but how many people were actually citizens? They might throw that in there, but they generally don't put it through a sexual or gender lens. And I think the more we bring a feminist and queer-facing scholarship into these things, the better we can understand how unfair and how these systems were, and how they continued and sustained unfair systems. Oh, one final thing. It's so easy looking at ancient stuff as we do. So in the modern world, people will say, oh, I don't have a racist bone in my body. I am not racist. And then therefore there is no racism, because we are conditioned to look at things individually. It's the same with the ancient world. You'll look at it and say, oh, well, this person or this person, they weren't racist, or they didn't do racist or bad things. But we forget that social inequality is systemic. And we have to look at the system and understand how that's replicating itself again and again. And if we don't do that, we have a problem. Yes, Hatshepsut pops along within this unequal system and is able to do something, but how much is she able to work given the system that she's been given?
Right, which is why it is so difficult to explain how Hatshepsut worked in like even in college, because you have to say this is a strongly patriarchal system, but somehow a woman reaches the top, but she has to change and she has to play, with gender constraints and representation. This brings me very nicely to another question that I had prepared, and then I promise we will get into the meat and flesh of the book, but this one. So your previous book, When Women Ruled the World, is about female or female rulers, not female power in ancient Egypt. So how do you see these two books in a dialogue between each other?
Yeah, I wrote When Women Ruled the World. Well, it was released in 2018, and then The Good Kings was released 2021, and we all are of our zeitgeist. And when I wrote When Women Ruled the World, we weren't there in the United States yet, where we had no F's left to give, at least on the left of the political spectrum. And I would write things like, I remember in the Cleopatra chapter, I wanted to compare Cleopatra within an Isis cult to a Jesus cult and of a mystery, and how you could actually equate these two things. And I got pulled back. They're like, no, this is a bit much, right? And other little things where I would try to bring my subversive self into things, and I was told, you can't really discuss that. I wanted to include the word affability, but I'm saying it in a nice way here with regards to Hillary Clinton or other older female leaders, because I think it's an important way of understanding female value in the modern and ancient world. And there is no better word for me that helps us to understand a woman's value than that one. But so that I would have written that book differently if I wrote it today. I think I would have been bolder and I would have seen more. So The Good Kings is still written from that feminist anti-patriarchal perspective, but it goes further. So it's taking all of that work, but it's then highlighting the males of the system. And then the first chapter and the last chapter are very much about the perspective of the non-male patriarch within this system, trying to work within it. And I do think they work in dialogue. One, certainly, The Good Kings ups the ante, let's put it that way. It is a bolder book. And I think When Women Ruled the World, people are allowed to consume that and not feel like they're being subversive. Whereas The Good Kings, you open it and it hits you in the face. You're like, oh my God, this is punching the whole field in the nose. And that's, I think, problematic for many people. So I think The Good Kings will, it has legs, in my opinion. It will be there kind of haunting some of the discourses, but it's not going to be that book that people go out and buy because it makes them feel good about being a woman or being a feminist. I think it brings up so many uncomfortable questions that people would rather avoid it for now. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with having written it because, again, I had to write it. I was compelled to do so.
Fairer order than you were. No, I'm joking. But kind of.
Yeah,
Um,
the zeitgeist made me kind of, right? I mean, I wrote it in lockdown. That's the other thing. Writing something in lockdown makes you brave because you're not going to the university every day. You're not in those systems. You're not getting told, well, that's a bit much. You're writing it in this space of thought in your head. We all remember what those early days of lockdown were like, where we're kind of all in our heads and we're figuring out Zoom and we're not talking in the same communities. We're not going to conferences and other things. And I think that book was written in a private, more ballsy space without as much feedback between the community and myself, except within the younger generation, because I wrote it in the context of a class. I was teaching a class and I took my book proposal and I put it into different sections of the class and created PowerPoints that went along with those sections of the class. So I taught it to 200 people. It's not like I didn't get feedback for this. And I also did a tremendous number of Facebook Lives while I was writing this book to do.
I was following those from the lockdown as well.
Which were also rather subversive, but I don't think I would have done those Facebook Lives in that way if the pandemic had not been raging around us. It gave me a bravery that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And then the book comes out when we're all going back into the world and people are like, what the hell is this? This is horrible, this or that, whatever it is people want to say. But it's interesting to see how that worked for my process as well.
Yes, the lockdown was challenging for writing, even for writing like dissertations. I can't imagine writing a book in there. But then again, with fewer, let's say, restraints, maybe that's where the good books come from. That's where you find, the bravery and like the no less given anymore, because I mean the world is ending, so might as well.
Yeah, I mean it gave me some freedom too, because I wrote the book with my 20 some years of experience under me, and how do we write as academics? But we prioritize the secondary text. And we look at what other people have written and we outline or create our outlines for what we're going to write based on what other people have written before and how we're going to counteract those other people, rather than sitting down and saying, what do I want to say? And when you're really first learning, you have to start with the secondary literature as your foundation and then go to what you have to say. As you get more, as you age into the system and you get a little more confident in the way things work, you can create your voice through what you want to say with just an intuitive feel of what is out there. And then you go off and say, okay, well, where do I need to footnote this? Where is the evidence for this or that? I worked more with primary texts, which I have in my own library, right? So I worked with primary texts and then left a lot of the secondary literature, pushed that to the side and was like, okay, I don't even have access to the library in the way that I did. So let's do this with the Egyptians and me. And that's kind of the way I took it on. So in some ways that certainly colors the book, and some people might be like, well, that's a problem, maybe. But I think it gave a certain freedom to the book as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly one thing that the pandemic has given us is a certain level of, I guess, time to reevaluate and set new standards for ourselves. Mm-hmm. We do have some comments in the chat that I'll just read off right now. Colin Mungo notes that this is really fascinating, even for a layman, and as well noted that we're really making me consider my fanboy attitude to classical Athens. And I think that's something that a lot of us had, at least starting out, myself included, was this glorified vision of the past. And as we dive into it more, as you said, we have a lot more to question.
Yeah. I mean, and you can track it, right? So track when the movie 300 came out and you've got, right? And then, how would that be done differently today? Or would it? Maybe it wouldn't. And there's an exhibition touring the United States right now all about Ramses II from Egypt that has absolutely nothing critical to say about Ramses II at all, not one thing. And that is so very interesting to me, that you're not even going to nuance it in any way, shape, or form. He is just our glorious leader. That's extraordinary.
It is, yeah. And I'm actually tomorrow in Boston going to a King Tut exhibit that's touring that I suspect is going to be similar, but I'm very curious as to what they're putting out there for the public to see.
May I
We
point
do all
out-
kinds of.
Sorry.
The King Tut, no, the King Tut stuff is super interesting because it certainly fanboys the King and the Gold and the Excess, but it also fanboys the Discoverer. So you've got your Howard Carter, Lord Carnarvon fanboying, you've got your Zahi Hawass fanboying, and it's all embedded into the patriarchal text. It's super interesting.
Ramesses the second would be very pleased that people are fanboying over him.
Oh yes.
He would love that. I'm sure he loves it.
Anytime a king haunting us is looking at ancient aliens where they say that the aliens built the pyramids, they're like, ha,
You're like,
it's
oh,
still
yeah.
working. I've still got it. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm still drinking the Kool-Aid. Oh, speaking of which, actually, let's get into the people in the book. So one thing that made me laugh is Senwosret III and his propaganda persisting when Herodotus went to Egypt, because they were drinking the Kool-Aid like up to them, but they expanded it, and I think like Senwosret would have loved it.
Yeah,
because they put him as the conqueror of Scythia, and then he went, further than Nubia into the east and up there. And then the thing that is mostly staggering for people when they first come into contact with Senwosret is this great, powerful king, and they expect to see, I don't know, He-Man or an action hero, and then his face. So I was wondering if you had a little more to say about the way in which his portrayal of himself as a stern father works with his figure of the mighty warrior for modern audiences, because that's something that can be kind of disconnected for us.
I think we do this every day. I think that you can Google an image of Putin, and I use this in my PowerPoints. I have an image of Vladimir Putin on horseback, with his serious face, and he's got no shirt on, and he's all ripped, and because he probably exercises 2 hours a day or whatever it is. I don't know what he looks like now without a shirt on. I don't want to know, but it's very interesting that I think this Senwosret III image of aged face and ripped body prioritizes that value of the older man. Think of the woman when she's reached menopause in that age. She is valueless. Put her to work, put her into servitude. We don't need to see her. She needs to be behind closed doors. She has no affability. We're just done with her, right? But this dude, this patriarch, this man who is leading the charge and has this great wisdom, everybody wants to combine the aged face that knows more with that ripped body. And I would take the Senwosret III, and for those of you that don't know Senwosret the third, his face, it just smacks you in the face. This careworn, dour, maybe pissed off, big ears. Like the ears are seriously like this big. I have big ears, see, but like these ears are massive. They're not humanly possible, right? And then it's a juxtaposition, the incongruity between that face and the body. But is it an incongruity? This is the patriarchal's masturbatory dream, to have, if I may, to have that older male with that young ripped body. And I would compare Senwosret III too. There was a wonderful exhibition at the Getty Center not long ago called Beyond the Nile. That was curated by Jeffrey Spear and Sarah Cole. And they had in there two gray wacky pieces. Gray wacky is a kind of stone. It's sometimes called schist or slate, but gray wacky is apparently the appropriate geological term. It's a green stone. It's a stone associated with gold mines of Wadi Hammamat. And those two statues are unattributed, and one is from a private collection, but they were of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony in that gray wacky stone with their careworn faces and the lines in there, but in this Egyptian stone. And I loved it because you could see that the Romans were fanboying Egypt too. But the ones who fanboyed Egypt, if they fanboyed too hard, they got killed for it, because everyone knew what that meant. If they had control of Egypt, they would have so much wealth at their disposal that they would upset that balance of elites. And of course, that is in the end what happened with Octavian. But you can see over the longue durée, the Senwosret III ideal of older man and young body it continues, and it continues to Hadrian. It continues on, right? So it continues to Trump. You can make all kinds of comparisons of how we treat the older male patriarch and prioritize his wisdom with his strength and virility, and why it is so important for us to not undermine the politicians like Berlusconi with the girlfriends and all this stuff, because we want them to be virile and young. We want them to be the wise politician, and yet the guy with the harem of his own. That makes us feel comfortable or proud or something. That is the system that we work within. And the ancient Egyptians perfected it. They made it religious. They made it sacred. It is harder for us to see within the context of the sacred, but it's the same as what we do with the only sacred being a patriotic sacred, for instance.
I did not expect to hear Berlusconi's name, but I should have expected it.
It works. It works.
It's a national shame. Anyway, but it works. It works. And his friends and predecessors too. So remaining on the figures in your book, how did you choose who made the cut and who did not? Like, did you have like a list and you went through, I don't know, brackets and chose who, like, one against the other? Did you just have, I don't know, prophetic dreams, dreaming of them and them telling you, I need to be in your book? How did you decide? And who did not make the cut? Because when I read the title, I thought the one in particular would have been there, but I'm not going to tell you the name. I'll see if you name him, and then we'll,
Who did you think should have been there? Thutmose the Third?
Amenhotep the Second.
And
his war crimes.
Yeah, I mean, Amenhotep the Second, or before him, Thutmose the Third. I mean, it makes sense to include them. But what I ended up doing was, if all of Egyptian history over the longue durée is a wave of ups and downs, right? I wanted the king at the very top, the king who was sowing the seeds of his own destruction, the king that was about to be on the downward slide. And so Thutmose III he's too much on the upswing, or Amenhotep II, a little too much on the upswing. Even Amenhotep III, he's there haunting the Akhenaten chapter, but it's not like you don't have the grand excess and then the grand fall. And that was what I wanted to track. I wanted to track how patriarchy again and again sows the seeds of its own demise in the very system itself, and then rebuilds itself bigger and better every single time. And that we are still doing this and have been doing this since complex civilization, however you want to define it. And we could bring in Wenger and Graeber or whatever, but however you define that, we continue to rebuild it. And that's why the last chapter of The Good Kings is such a call to place this antiquity into the modern world, because if we continue to try to do this, we will end up destroying our very home, our very planet. It is that unsustainable, it is that destructive, and it is that cruel a system. And I wanted to remind all of the historians out there, because we can get lost in thinking that the patriarchal system is the only way that there is. There are many other ways to move forward in the world, and humanity being on the planet for some 250,000 years. Patriarchy is maybe 10,000 years old at most. And there's much more to it. But so the kings that I picked are those guys at the very top of the wave, about to crest, right? When people were living at a time thinking, oh, this could never happen. We'll never lose all of this. The time period when kings were burying themselves in the Valley of the Kings, not in secret, but with aplomb and a big open view and an audience, and everyone look at my awesome tomb, because it cannot come into their head that this whole system could crumble and fall apart. It can't even be thought of, because we have so much, and this has been going on for so long. Human beings are short-term thinkers, and I wanted that short-term thought in the leadership of this book. So it's funny how easy that choice ended up being. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to take these 5 guys, and that's it. Taharqa was an afterthought. I put in, and I'm like, we need this because we need someone who's the product of colonialism and that hegemonic cruelty, who then comes back and tries to build very much the same. And it's the same discussion that I'm having with colleagues about Egypt and Sudan. There's there's a lot of Afrocentrism out there that's very patriarchal that tries to then say, oh, Sudan did it first, or Nubia did it first, and try to create a primacy. It's all patriarchal pissing contests, in my opinion. When you add a feminist discussion into it, like Solange Ashby does, who will soon be teaching at UCLA as latter faculty, then it changes that. We can transcend the patriarchy and have the discussion from a different lens. So Taharka, he was a perfect fit as well. He was probably the hardest to write because he's not as much in my wheelhouse, but I think he had to make that cut.
That is excellent. And now that you're explaining, I see why like the ones that I like immediately thought of would not have fit, because they were just, still going up. Like the trajectory was still up. I was very happy that Taharka was there. I was ironically sad about when you say that Taharka and his dynasty are doing politically manufactured nostalgia, which is exactly what their successors also do. Like the Said Kings, which is a dynasty which I work with, but on the other side of the Mediterranean, because they are manufacturing this nostalgia, but not for their immediate predecessors or no one before. They are nostalgic of the 18th dynasty. So clearly they had drank the Kool-Aid, and they tried to style themselves as, those, uber pharaohs that they have heard of and that they still remember. But it is fantastic. I was wondering, how much would have people, there's one paragraph in the Ramses II chapter in which you talk about how he's juxtaposing himself to Akhenaten and his cronies going and, chiseling things out. This is a layman, laywoman question. How much would have people actually remembered about things that had happened before? Like the average Egyptian, would they have noticed how things were changing? Have they remembered that there has been quote unquote heresy running amok? How would they have made sense of that, if we can answer yes? Because if the answer is we need a seance for that, then I'll take you come to your word. But
yeah, memory is such an interesting thing, and cultural memory is such an interesting thing. And again, I'm using texts, but also images, but mainly text to understand and find my way into this cultural memory. I think that cultural memory of an oppressed people that is only spoken can be harder to get at until it's actually written down. But that kind of cultural memory can be maintained for millennia. But a cultural memory that is purposefully maintained by the state is very easy to track, because they're constantly reminding people of what was. And you could compare it to the cultural memory of the United States, which is 250 years old, but were any of us there to remember it? Do we have great grandparents to tell us? Absolutely not. But how often do we talk about the founding fathers and what their intents were? It engages in our decisions about women's control over their own bodies right now, what the founding fathers thought. It's kind of ridiculous, but it is a cultural memory that goes back 250 years that is formed and shaped by those in control of our political system. We are willfully reminded of, oh, well, Thomas Jefferson wanted to set all of his enslaved people free. He did with some, not with all. And what does that mean? And we create these discussions of goodness in some of our leaders. So looking at the Egyptian text, you can see that they're constantly harping on this and reminding everyone of what can go wrong if kingship is not pure and good, if it takes too many licenses, if it's of excess. And there is this great pushback against that kind of kingship. And the Ramessids are in there saying, we're going to drain the swamp. You guys had to deal with this horrible kingship before. And the temples are all there standing. They're like, look at what these kings did to you. I'm going to bring you in and welcome you into the temple in a different way. It's no surprise that Ramses II, when he builds his hypostyle halls, includes the symbol of the rehit bird, the common people, on those columns to say they are welcome here. And it's funny, you read the Egyptological literature and people are like, were the common people allowed into the hypostyle hall? Were they not? And we don't ask in terms of the longue durée. We just ask, oh, as if the temple's a static place. Were people allowed into a hypostyle hall? They're not asking, were they allowed in the time of Amenhotep III versus the time of Ramses II? Because I think it changed. A populist king is going to drain the swamp, differentiate himself from the previous administration, even if it was some 100 years before, and use that constructed cultural memory to aggrandize his own purity, his own innocence. Innocence manufacturing is everything. And for that, I rely on James Baldwin. For those of you who know about James Baldwin's writing about what it means to be Black in the United States and what it means to be white and maintain a system of social inequality, it's very useful because you can understand that people are using all kinds of things to construct a purity of individuality and say, well, I would never, that's the past, or that's not me, that's the system. And then you can maintain these social inequalities and benefit from them without ever feeling like you've done anything wrong. We love to do that. Human beings, they they love to lie to themselves in these ways. And I'm sure I'm lying to myself right now in some way, right? That's the way that the whole system works.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And we all have our own biases. Just a note for those of you watching, we've got a few more minutes. So if you have a question, definitely drop it in the chat. I guess the last question that I want to leave off with is, we've talked a lot about the problems within academia currently and where we need to go. I tend to be a person of action. I like to get things done. So how exactly do you see us affecting change in academics? Like, what can we do?
Well, this is a tough one. Okay, here we go, Cassandra. Because I think we all know that academia is being destroyed by late capitalism, by privatization, by third-party contract work versus long-term work. That there are those of us who love the ancient world, and some of us are lucky enough to have a position. And most of the students, the grad students that I train, they will not get a position, not because they're not amazing, but because the system is effed. And it's not working for the empowerment of people. It is actually working in a toxic environment that is weakening people. So the students who work with me, they know what I think of the current academic system, and that you may get a position, but then what do you do with that, and how toxic a place are you willing to sustain yourself within? UCLA is I think in some ways less toxic because it is so faculty led, but there's only so many positions, and we have a lecturers union. Yeah, we're not outsourcing as much to third parties, but most other universities, it's a completely different system. It is very much a pay to play game right now. And it's no surprise then that there are 3 women here talking to one another. I know we were going to have Christian Casey involved, but academia has been taken over in the humanities by women. And again, people love to create a positivist spin to this and say, oh, look, the women are now so important and they're equal in all of this. BS. Women are allowed into a failing game when it's at its nadir, because then fine, let the chicks in. It's, what's it going to hurt? The reason women are allowed in to humanities academia is because it's not a viable career choice anymore. It's a toxic workplace of extraordinary competition and very little payback for the extraordinary work that one puts into it. So, academia, case in point, is like, it is the end game of late stage capitalist patriarchy. And I don't know what else to say, except that we have to go through the fire together and understand what that is. And if in the United States, we're creating underground railroads so that women can have control over their own bodies, and you help transport a girl out of Texas who doesn't want to have a baby at 17 and find a way to do that, which many people are doing. We also, as you are doing here, need to create underground railroads that are subversive against this academic system that is not serving the public. It is not serving the academics. It's not serving the students. And it's pretty much a shit show, in my opinion. And it needs to be, we need to go through this fire and remake it and see what we can do. And this is coming from an American perspective, but I look across the pond to Britain and I see what's happened in their Thatcherist higher education there, and I see what's happened, Kate, in Italy in higher education. It's brutal, and we are not. Germany's going through its own fire, and it's so interesting when you see this late stage academia, and you see some of these scholars who are, at a later stage of their career and have the platform, and they're like, no, we must just look at things like this and put on the blinders and particularize the hell out of everything and don't have a larger perspective and are as in the weeds as one can possibly be, rather than asking bigger questions and asking why it even matters that we study antiquity and what does antiquity have to say about the present. And this is why I write trade books. This is why I write popular books, which my own colleagues at UCLA, I went through a promotion and they're like, oh, it's another popular book. We're not going to count it. This is stupid. And so I deal with this myself in my own academic world. That it shouldn't surprise anybody that people look askance and give side eye to popularity, whatever that means. But it is my own means of creating that underground railroad. My podcast can do that, right? We can create for people who love to study the ancient world. I mean, what's my old saying that, oh, I love antiquity and then I went to grad school. And they're just going to beat it out of you, right? And they're going to footnote it to death and it's just going to be destroyed. Any love that you had will be destroyed by the potential toxicity of that larger academic space. And all of the emotional baggage that you then inherit when you move into that space. So I think we all need to try in our own way to create different mechanisms of discourse, different ways of learning about the ancient world and trying to remake what this even is. There's more one could say. You could do a whole segment on that one question.
Yeah, no, it's certainly something I could go on about forever, endlessly, just based on my limited experience so far. Just for a bit of clarification, Justin Bryce did ask on Facebook, for people who are on the outside, what does toxic mean within the university system?
Yeah. Oh, that's a big question. Let's see. Let's say that you're in a place with a great advisor. You're working on exactly the dissertation you want to be working in. And you're in a community of kindred souls who are just as enamored in the ancient world and need to time travel just as much as you do for whatever weird reason that we do. And we all know that we share this, right? And so everything's great there. Let's say that you're getting paid for your labor as a TA and you're doing well and you're making a living and you're able to pay your rent and everything's fine. Okay, so it's puppies and rainbows, right? Everything's fine. Well, when you finish, even in this shielded space in graduate school and you get your PhD and you go out onto the market, there simply are no good jobs for people who are being trained. And it is a fight to the death for those to get those jobs. It's like who you know, it's a lottery, it's a brutal way forward to get some of these positions. And then let's say you get a position and you end up teaching a 4-4, 4 classes one semester, 4 classes another semester at a liberal arts college, and you're just put to work in a way that is rather soul destroying. You don't have a lot of say over your own career. You don't have faculty governance. You're like, oh, I worked all of this time and all of this space for what? And we all see how, particularly in the pandemic, where in the United States, if we've lost 1 million souls documented, let's say we've lost 3 million. I mean, really, it seems fair to me to say that 3 million people died in the United States, if not more. And that as these people die or leave or retire, they are not replaced. And we all end up doing more work. And the amount of work that each one person is doing to maintain the system that, 2 or 3 people would have had in the 1960s, it's just overwhelming. And all we do is work. And so when you get that 4-4 position, you're like, oh, I'm going to be able to teach and I'll go into the field and all of these things. But that work weighs upon you in such a way. I don't know how to tell you how much staff work, administrative work we end up doing, how many letters of recommendation we're writing, how incredibly time consuming and soul destroying these jobs are, because the system is trying to get that very last drop of blood from the stone. And so it is, there are many people that are leaving academia because they simply can't sustain it emotionally, financially. It's a really tough place to be. You could love your classroom and love your students and still not be able to sustain the amount of work emotionally that you have to perform. In my particular case, I have so much work that there came a point in my life where I have a child. I'm like, I can either pay more for childcare or I can get a personal assistant to help me to deal with things that I don't have time to do. I chose the latter path, and I rely on this personal assistant to help me with all kinds of things. And that means I'm paying a huge part of my salary that I get from UCLA to a personal assistant so that I can do the work that is expected. I can't keep up with it otherwise and still write popular books and do other things. I would not be able to do all of this other work that I want to do. So I've found a workaround myself, but not everyone is paid enough to be able to do that. So it's there's and then let me then move forward with it, and I'll you can let you guys ask another question. I gave you the best case scenario for the academic world. There's a lot of horrible scenarios out there in which there is true toxicity in the academic field, and where there are universities in which an advisor has extraordinary power over the people whom they advise, such that they can tell them how to dress, how to talk, what to do, maybe even pick up their dry cleaning and walk their dogs. There are all kinds of stories about these things. There is sexual harassment, of course. There's relationships that students have because they feel it'll help them move forward in their career, et cetera, et cetera. Not that these things don't happen in the larger workplace, but the academic world being this life of the mind and the choice of the, your soul is calling you to this. It is a calling, and we are doing it not for the money, but because we can't think of anything else that we want to do with our lives. We love it. So that makes you a mark. It makes you a mark for people who can unload their toxicity onto you. And it creates a very dangerous and uneven playing field for those who love something so much they don't understand that some of the places where they want to study are incredibly cruel. I'll leave it there. I think a lot of people know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not going to name names. There's no point in doing that. There's a hell of a lot of toxic places out there in academia.
Definitely. And as Balaja is telling us in the Twitch, a lot of us are going to the public scholarship route because everything else is not sustainable. And that's the other issue with contingent faculty is being expected to be able to move freely. And some of us cannot for many different reasons. So I think you're
Kate, how dare you choose your personal life over your academic career? It's like we're all meant to be monks who follow Jesus. And if we don't do that, we don't love antiquity enough. There is a weird cultishness to this field. And if you actually are like, no, I'm going to be with my family and have a good personal life, how dare you? And it is a beautiful thing that podcasts, digital humanities, popular facing books are considered less than by the academic world because of their subversivity. So embrace that subversiveness. It is where the field must go. And people can give it side eye and say, oh my God, this is horrible. As long as they want, I don't care, do it. But as the generations roll on and the millennials take over and the Gen Zs take over, this conversation will continue because we are destroying academia from the inside out, and we must start creating something new now.
Fair, and it's good to hear because I'm at the end of my PhD and I have big doubts about going forward because I got lucky enough that I got married, but I cannot move around anymore. Not that I wanted to because I was tired. I changed 3 countries to do 3 different degrees. It's tiring after a while. So but yes, and also the people looking down upon public scholarship, especially this is more my field, archaeogaming. It's like, oh, that's not really archaeology. That's not really a real field, but it is. I mean, and we can make it one, right? What is a real discipline? What is a real field? It's something that we decide is real, right?
No, and we have to start with antiquity studies being, these are all stories that we tell each other. That's it. There is no time machine that is going to give you the pure, unvarnished antiquity. It does not exist. They're all stories. And given that we know they're all stories, then if you go through it through a digital means or a video gaming means, let me tell you, nothing brings in the students like that. And then people get more pissed off. They're like, oh, well, you're not doing it right. You're using this video gaming thing. No wonder your class is so popular, and you will be belittled for that as well, because you're not teaching the serious history. But we just have to hold your course and do what brings the discourse. And academia will, as I say, Egyptology is dying. And it is up to us to remake it into something else. It's an interesting time to be alive in academia, but it's certainly a scary time too. And my students, the most important thing is to at least have a clear-eyed view of what it is you're dealing with. Most advisors in high-level academic work are training grad students with no understanding of what alternative academic jobs could be, of how a PhD is a fungible commodity that you can use in the private sector, that there is failure if you don't get an academic position. There is no failure. You might be much more successful with something more public facing or in a different kind of a position. And we need more open thought like that.
Living through historic times is it's somewhat scary. But
what did Gandalf say? And
I was thinking about that exact quote.
What did Gandalf say? It's like, we don't choose the times that we're living through, but we have to do the best with the time that we are given. And we are living here at the beginnings of in my opinion, this is the last chapter of the Good Kings. We are living in the beginnings of a new human revolution. That is an anti-patriarchal revolution in which we are creating something new, something sustainable, something that is not just prioritizing the hegemonic masculine system, that toxic masculinity. And what does that mean? And if we're at the beginnings of that, it's the messiest time. It's like the 20th dynasty before you got into the third intermediate period. I hate to use my own particular examples, it's when most of the tombs were ransacked. It's when most of the civil wars were happening before you reach some kind of a steady state. It's also the time when the patriarch fights back the most. No surprise that in the United States that we have a mass shooting by a patriarch every day, multiple times a day. That's what that is.
Unfortunately. Well, I hope that this was, unfortunately, we have to like wrap up at something else. I'm also reminded of something that you said on your podcast about periods of crisis, like the end of the Bronze Age ushering better times. So I hope that is true. That gave me hope in some really difficult days that I was having. So I think that
there is so much hope in this.
I hope so.
Beautiful. It is a beautiful. We have to go into it fearlessly and bravely because it's all being revealed for the first time to so many eyes. That's gorgeous. It's scary as F, but it is gorgeous. And so you got, and that's why they fight so hard. And that's why the pushback is so cruel. So that we're going to have 14-year-olds peeing on sticks to find out if they're pregnant before they leave Alabama. Let's see, you're going to do that? I want to see you do that because that's really interesting. And so, oh no, now there's a gardener with his music playing. I hope you can't hear that. But let's try to go boldly into this. It's, what's really interesting about this anti-patriarchal time. So many of my students, so many Gen Zers and millennials are not having children, which makes them braver because they're like, what? Come at me. What have you got? I've got my 12-year-old, but I see his bravery already at 12 of fighting for non-binary rights or fighting for, fighting against the man. And this is a white boy, right? But I can see that in his generation. And we have a whole lot of people that are not buying into the system who are not going to be afraid when people are pushing back from the other side. You're gonna kill me in a big shooting? What are you gonna do? Let's bring it on and see what can happen. So embrace that we're all here, we're all listening to these things, we're all reading and we're all discussing. That is the most hopeful thing that I can think of.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. We need that. We need to remember that even with all the problems, all the things we've highlighted, even just today in the past hour, that we can, move forward and hopefully make better. And yeah, I think it's about time for us to wrap up, but Cara, Kate, if either of you have anything you want to plug, absolutely go for it.
Follow SASA, donate to SASA, follow us when we start our new Arco Gaming series end of August. And yeah, get ready for more flailing and yelling with a heavy Italian accent. That is my plug.
I love it. And now I think I'm a public scholar associated with SASA or something
Yes.
like that. So I'm now
Mhm.
legit, which is awesome. And for those of you that want to know more about me, my podcast is the best place to start. You can look to my books, The Good Kings or When Women Ruled the World. But the podcast is we get subversive every week, and I work with Jordan Gelzinski and Amber Myers-Wells, and we come up with different topics, and we're just always looking at the news and saying, oh, we should talk about this, we should talk about that. And I couldn't do it without Jordan. And I think it also adds having a millennial voice and a Gen X voice, that we have a generational dialogue going, which is really fun. So I think we're on episode, we're in our 20s. We're young, but we're creating some episodes, and there's a lot for you to listen to. And it's called Afterlives of Ancient Egypt. So you can, and it's got a yellow little square, and it's everywhere that podcasts are offered, Apple Music or Spotify or any of those places. And for other stuff, you can look at my website, which is just Google Cara Cooney and you'll find it.
We put it in the chat on Twitch.
Awesome.
All right. Yeah. And thank you everyone for joining us. Look for our other live events. We'll be posting them as they happen, and we're ending the stream. Thank you.
Thank you all.